1915, a combined force of French and British troops arrived in Salonika, Greece, with the aim of supporting the government and persuading it to declare war on the Central Powers. However, their efforts were thwarted when King Constantine I, who favored the Germans, ousted the pro-Allied government of Eleftherios Venizelos before they could make their move. For a time, the Macedonian front remained relatively stagnant, but in November 1916, French and Serbian forces managed to retake the city of Bitola after a grueling offensive. This small victory brought some stability to the front, but it wasn't until September 1918 that the Allies made a significant breakthrough. As German and Austro-Hungarian troops withdrew from the region, Serbian and French forces launched a successful offensive, defeating the Bulgarians at the Battle of Dobro Pole. British and French troops soon crossed into Bulgaria, causing the Bulgarian army to collapse. Bulgaria surrendered on September 29, 1918. The German High Command responded by sending in reinforcements, but they were too weak to stem the tide. With the collapse of the Macedonian front, the Allies had now opened up a path to Budapest and Vienna. The German generals, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, realized that the balance of power had shifted decisively against the Central Powers and urged for an immediate peace settlement. As the war escalated, the Ottoman Empire posed a significant threat to Russia's Caucasian territories and Britain's vital communication lines with India through the Suez Canal. Seizing the opportunity, the Ottomans unleashed a wave of brutal ethnic cleansing against the native Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian Christian populations, inflicting unimaginable horrors upon these communities. Meanwhile, the British and French launched campaigns in distant lands to challenge Ottoman dominance. The ill-fated Gallipoli campaign of 1915 saw the Ottoman Empire successfully repel the Allied forces, including British, French, and Anzac troops. However, in Mesopotamia, the British regrouped after their initial defeat at Kut and eventually captured Baghdad in March 1917, aided by local Arab and Assyrian allies. The Ottomans, on the other hand, relied on Kurdish and Turkoman tribes in the region. On the Western Front, the Suez Canal came under Ottoman attack in 1915 and 1916, but the Allies successfully defended it. The tide turned in favor of the Allies in August 1916, when the Anzac Mounted Division and the 52nd Lowland Infantry Division defeated a combined German and Ottoman force at the Battle of Romani. This victory paved the way for the Egyptian Expeditionary Force to advance across the Sinai Peninsula, driving the Ottomans back in the battles of Magdaba in December 1916 and Rafah in January 1917. In the Caucasus, Russian forces generally enjoyed success, but Enver Pasha, the Ottoman supreme commander, harbored grand ambitions of reconquering lost territories in Central Asia. His military prowess, however, did not match his ambition. In December 1914, he launched a disastrous offensive against Russian positions in the Caucasus, insisting on a frontal assault in the dead of winter. The result was a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Sarikamish, where he lost a staggering 86% of his troops. As World War I raged on, the Ottoman Empire, backed by Germany, launched an invasion of Persia, modern-day Iran, in December 1914. Their goal was to sever British and Russian access to the lucrative petroleum reservoirs around Baku, near the Caspian Sea. Despite Persia's declared neutrality, the country had long been under the influence of Britain and Russia. The Ottoman forces were bolstered by Kurdish and Azeri allies, as well as various Iranian tribes, while the British and Russians had the support of Armenian and Assyrian forces. The Persian campaign would prove to be a long and arduous one, lasting until 1918, and ultimately ending in defeat for the Ottomans and their allies. However, the Russian withdrawal from the war in 1917 left Armenian and Assyrian forces in a precarious position, forcing them to fight their way towards British lines in northern Mesopotamia. Meanwhile, General Yudenich, the Russian commander from 1915 to 1916, achieved a series of victories that drove the Turks out of much of the southern Caucasus. The British instigated an Arab revolt through Sharif of Mecca in June 1916, which started with the Battle of Mecca. The revolt would eventually lead to the Ottoman surrender of Damascus. In another theater of the war, the Senussi tribe, armed and incited by the Turks, waged a guerrilla war against Allied troops along the border of Italian Libya and British Egypt. The British were forced to deploy 12,000 troops to quell the rebellion, which was finally crushed in mid-1916. The Ottoman fronts proved to be a bloody and costly theater of the war, with total Allied casualties amounting to 650,000 men. The Ottomans suffered even heavier losses, with 725,000 casualties, including 325,000 dead and 400,000 wounded. Italy's allegiance was a subject of debate in the early 20th century. Despite joining the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1882, the country's governments consistently denied the existence of the treaty and its terms, which were only made public in 1915. The reason for this secrecy lay in Italy's long-standing rivalry with Austria, which had led to a desire to expand its borders into Austro-Hungarian territory in Trentino, the Austrian Littoral, Rijeka, and Dalmatia. In 1902, Italy made a secret agreement with France, promising to remain neutral if France were attacked by Germany. This effectively rendered Italy's role in the Triple Alliance null and void. When World War I broke out in 1914, Italy argued that the Triple Alliance was defensive in nature and that it was under no obligation to support Austria's attack on Serbia. As the war progressed, Italy's opposition to joining the Central Powers grew, especially after Turkey entered the fray in September 1914. Italy had previously occupied Ottoman territories in Libya and the Dodecanese Islands in 1911, and the idea of fighting alongside Turkey was unpalatable. To secure Italy's neutrality, the Central Powers offered to cede Tunisia to Italy, while the Allies promised to grant Italy Austrian territory and sovereignty over the Dodecanese in exchange for its immediate entry into the war. These secret provisions were incorporated into the Treaty of London in April 1915, and Italy eventually joined the Triple Entente, declaring war on Austria-Hungary on May 23, 1915, and Germany 15 months later. The Italian army faced significant challenges in the lead-up to World War I, including a shortage of officers, trained men, and modern weapons. Despite some improvements by April 1915, the army was still unprepared for a major offensive. The difficult terrain of the Alps and Dolomites, where much of the fighting took place, further complicated matters. Under the command of Luigi Cadorna, the Italian army launched a series of costly frontal assaults along the Isonzo River between 1915 and 1917, making little progress. The Austro-Hungarians counterattacked in the Strafe Expedition of 1916, but were repelled. The Italians did manage to capture Gorizia in August 1916, but their progress was halted until October 1917. A major defeat at Caporetto led to Cadorna's replacement by Armando Diaz, who retreated over 100 kilometers before holding the line along the Piave River. The Italians repelled a second Austrian offensive in June 1918 and launched a counterattack in October, which ultimately destroyed the Austro-Hungarian army. With the enemy in disarray, the Italians took over 300,000 prisoners and occupied key territories, including Trieste and areas along the Adriatic Sea. The Armistice of Villa Giusti on November 3, 1918, brought an end to hostilities between Austria-Hungary and Italy. As the war began, Russia launched a two-pronged attack on Austrian Galicia and East Prussia, aiming to force Germany to divert troops from the Western Front. While they achieved initial success in Galicia, their rapid mobilization came to devastating defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes. These losses forced them to withdraw from East Prussia, and by spring 1915, they had also retreated from Galicia. The tide turned in June 1916 with the Brusilov offensive, which dealt a significant blow to the Austrians in eastern Galicia. However, despite this victory, the Russian army struggled with supply shortages, heavy losses, and command failures, preventing them from fully capitalizing on their success. The offensive did have far-reaching consequences, diverting German resources from Verdun, relieving pressure on the Italians, and convincing Romania to join the Allies. However, the Russian army's offensive capabilities were severely weakened, and the war effort was marred by unrest and disillusionment back home. With the Tsar away at the front, Empress Alexandra's rule was marked by incompetence and food shortages, leading to widespread protests and the eventual murder of her favorite, Grigory Rasputin, in 1916. Romania's allegiance was torn between the Triple Alliance and the Entente powers in the early years of World War I, despite secretly agreeing to support the Central Powers in 1883. Romania grew increasingly at odds with them over their support for Bulgaria and the treatment of ethnic Romanians in Transylvania. The country's leaders were divided between pro-German and pro-Entente factions, leading to a policy of neutrality in 1914. However, Romania allowed Germany and Austria to transport military supplies and advisors across its territory, while also acknowledging Russian support for its claims to Austro-Hungarian territories, including Transylvania. As Russia gained ground against Austria, Romania finally joined the Entente in August 1916, with plans to launch an offensive into Transylvania. The Romanian army made initial gains, but was eventually driven back by the German Ninth Army, led by Erich von Falkenhayn. A combined German-Bulgarian-Turkish offensive then captured Dobruja and Giurgiu, forcing the Romanian army to retreat to Bucharest, which fell to the Central Powers in December 1916. Despite this, the bulk of the Romanian army managed to escape encirclement and continued to fight on. In the scorching summer of 1917, the Central Powers, led by the seasoned General August von Mackensen, launched a massive offensive in Romania, aiming to crush the country's resistance and force it out of the war. The ensuing battles of Oitus, Marasti, and Marasesti raged on for 42 days, from July 22nd to September 3rd, with a staggering 1 million Central Powers troops clashing against the determined Romanian army. Despite being outnumbered, the Romanians emerged victorious, gaining a significant 500 square kilometers of ground. The Central Powers' defeat was so decisive that General Mackensen was forced to divert his troops to the Italian front, abandoning plans for another offensive. As the Russian Revolution unfolded, Romania found itself isolated on the Eastern Front. In a bid to secure its borders, the country signed the Treaty of Bucharest with the Central Powers, ceding control of key mountain passes to Austria-Hungary and leasing its oil wells to Germany for 99 years. Although ratified by Parliament, King Ferdinand I refused to sign the treaty, holding out hope for an Allied victory in the West. Romania eventually re-entered the war on November 10, 1918, on the side of the Allies, and the Treaty of Bucharest was formally nullified by the Armistice of November 11, 1918. In December 1916, Germany, exhausted from the Battle of Verdun and its successful offensive against Romania, attempted to negotiate a peace treaty with the Allies. However, their efforts were met with skepticism and dismissed as a duplicitous war ruse. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, eager to broker a peace, asked both sides to outline their demands and begin negotiations. But the British War Cabinet, led by Lloyd George, viewed Germany's offer as a ploy to divide the Allies. After much deliberation, The Allies responded to Wilson's offer, signaling that the US was on the brink of entering the war against Germany. Meanwhile, Germany refused to engage with Wilson's proposal, opting instead for direct talks with the Allies. In response, the Allies presented a united front, demanding restitution, the evacuation of occupied territories, reparations, and recognition of nationalities, including the liberation of various ethnic groups and the creation of an independent Poland. The Allies also sought guarantees to prevent future wars, backed by sanctions. However, the negotiations ultimately failed, with the Entente powers rejecting Germany's offer due to a lack of specific proposals and concerns about honor. As the war dragged on, Russia's situation grew increasingly dire. By the end of 1916, the country had lost nearly 5 million soldiers, and food shortages and high prices had become rampant in major cities. In March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II attempted to quell a wave of strikes in Petrograd by ordering troops to fire on the crowds, but the soldiers refused to obey. The revolutionaries seized the opportunity to establish the Petrograd Soviet, a rival power center that threatened the authority of the state parliament, Duma. Fearing a leftist takeover, the Duma forced Tsar Nicholas to abdicate and established a provisional government. However, the Petrograd Soviet refused to disband, creating a power vacuum that led to chaos and demoralization among frontline soldiers. Meanwhile, Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik Party, was smuggled back into Russia from Switzerland with the help of the German government. As the provisional government struggled to maintain control, Lenin's party gained popularity, and he demanded an immediate end to the war. In December 1917, the Bolsheviks negotiated an armistice with Germany and eventually signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. The treaty marked a humiliating defeat for Russia, ceding vast territories to the Central Powers, including Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Poland and Ukraine. The treaty marked the end of Russia's involvement in World War I, but also led to the establishment of the Soviet Union, which would go on to shape the course of modern history. In the early years of World War I, the United States maintained its neutrality despite being a major supplier of war materials to the Allies. However, the tide turned in 1917 when Germany launched a submarine offensive that claimed American lives and disrupted trade. This shift in circumstances created the public support President Wilson needed to declare war on Germany as an associated power of the Allies on April 6, 1917. The U.S. military was significantly outnumbered by its European counterparts, with only 300,000 men compared to the millions serving in the British and French armies. To address this disparity, the Selective Service Act of 1917 was passed, drafting 2.8 million men into service. Despite the logistical challenges, over 667,000 American troops were transported to France by June 1918, with that number swelling to 2 million by November. President Wilson was determined to ensure the U.S. played a leading role in shaping the peace, and to achieve this, he insisted on maintaining the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, as a separate entity. This decision was supported by General John J. Pershing, who favored a more aggressive approach and disagreed with the British and French emphasis on artillery. As a result, American troops did not engage in significant combat until the Meuse-Argonne offensive in late September 1918, much to the frustration of their allies who had suffered heavy losses in the preceding years. In December 1916, Robert Nivelle took over as commander of the French armies on the Western Front, planning a spring offensive in Champagne as part of a joint operation with the British. Nivelle predicted a decisive breakthrough at the Chemin des Dames with minimal casualties. However, German intelligence was aware of the plans, and despite initial gains, the French were halted by the Hindenburg Line. Nivelle continued with frontal assaults, resulting in 135,000 French casualties by April 25th, including 30,000 dead. Meanwhile, the British had more success at Arras, and the Canadian Corps' capture of Vimy Ridge is considered a pivotal moment in Canadian national identity. However, the French Army mutinies began on May 3rd, with the 21st Division refusing orders, followed by widespread unrest and desertions across 54 divisions. The infantry's demands were mainly economic and logistical, including better support for families and regular leave, which Nivelle had discontinued. In 1917, German and Ottoman forces halted the Egyptian Expeditionary Forces' advance at the First and Second Battles of Gaza. However, in October 1917, General Edmund Allenby's forces resumed the offensive, winning the Battle of Beersheba. The Ottoman armies suffered subsequent defeats at the Battle of Mughar Ridge and the Battle of Jerusalem, leading to the capture of Jerusalem in December. The Ottoman command underwent changes, with Javad Pasha replacing Friedrich Freiherr Kress von Kressenstein and Otto Lehmann von Sanders replacing Erich von Falkenhayn. In early 1918, the British Empire forces expanded the front line, occupying the Jordan Valley after the first and second Transjordan attacks. As the war raged on, the Central Powers made a crucial decision in December 1917, signing an armistice with Russia and freeing up a significant number of German troops to focus on the Western Front. With fresh American troops joining the fray and German reinforcements pouring in, the outcome of the war hung in the balance. Ludendorff, the German commander, devised a bold plan, codenamed Operation Michael, to launch a massive offensive on the Western Front. The operation began on March 21, 1918, with a surprise attack on British forces near St. Quentin. The German army made unprecedented gains, advancing an astonishing 60 kilometers in just a few days. However, despite their initial success, the German army struggled to consolidate their gains. Without tanks or motorized artillery, they were unable to overcome the challenges of resupply and navigating the treacherous shell-torn terrain. Undeterred, the Germans launched a series of subsequent offensives, including Operation Georgette, which targeted the northern English Channel ports. Although they made some gains, the Allies ultimately halted their advance. The German army then shifted its focus to the south, launching Operations Blücher and York, which pushed deep into French territory, threatening Paris. In a final desperate bid to turn the tide of the war, Germany launched Operation Marne, also known as the Second Battle of the Marne, on July 15th. However, the Allies were prepared, and a decisive counterattack marked the beginning of the 100 Days Offensive on August 8th. The German army's morale began to crumble, and the war's outcome was all but certain. By September, the German army had retreated to the Hindenburg Line. The Allies had advanced to the line in the north and central regions. Despite numerous German counterattacks, the Allies continued to capture positions and outposts along the line. In the last week of September, the British Expeditionary Force, DEF, took over 30,000 German prisoners. On September 24th, the German Supreme Army Command informed Berlin that seeking an armistice was unavoidable. The Allies launched a final offensive on the Hindenburg Line on September 26th, with American and French troops leading the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This was followed by attacks around Ypres on September 28th and at St. Quentin on September 29th. The Allies continued to gain ground, breaking through the German lines in Champagne at the Battle of Blanc-Mont Ridge from October 3rd to 27, and piercing the Hindenburg Line at the Second Battle of Cambrai on October 8th. On September 15th, the Allied forces launched a major offensive on the Vardar front, targeting two strategic locations, Dobropol and Dodran Lake. The Serbian and French armies achieved a remarkable victory at Dobropol, breaking through the enemy lines after a fierce 3-day battle with surprisingly low casualties. As the front collapsed, the Allies pressed their advantage, liberating Serbia and advancing rapidly. By September 29th, they had reached Skopje, a key city in the region. The Bulgarians, realizing the futility of further resistance, signed an armistice with the Allies on September 30th, effectively ending their participation in the war. The Central Powers' collapse was swift and decisive. It began with Bulgaria's armistice on September 29, 1918, followed by Germany's acknowledgement of their dire situation. Italy launched a successful offensive on October 24th, culminating in the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, which shattered the Austro-Hungarian army's effectiveness. This led to declarations of independence in various cities, and Austria-Hungary requested an armistice on October 29th. However, Italy continued advancing until Austria-Hungary accepted the Allied terms on November 3rd, signing the armistice of Villa Giusti. The Ottoman Empire soon followed, capitulating on October 30th with the armistice of Mudros. In the aftermath, the Italian army occupied key territories, and the Central Powers' defeat marked the end of World War I. As the German military faltered and the people's faith in their leader dwindled, Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate and flee the country. Amidst the chaos, Prince Maximilian of Baden stepped forward to lead a new government, taking on the role of Chancellor on October 3rd. With a sense of urgency, he reached out to President Woodrow Wilson, hoping to secure more favorable terms from the American leader than those offered by the British and French. Wilson, however, drove a hard bargain, insisting that Germany adopt a constitutional monarchy and submit its military to parliamentary control. The fate of Germany hung in the balance as negotiations unfolded. In the final days of October 1918, a spark of defiance ignited in northern Germany, setting off a chain reaction that would change the course of history. Sailors in the German Navy, weary of a war they believed was doomed, refused to obey orders to launch a final, desperate assault. This bold act of disobedience in the naval ports of Wilhelmshaven and Kiel marked the beginning of a full-blown uprising that swept across the nation like wildfire. As protests and demonstrations erupted in cities everywhere, the once mighty German Empire began to crumble. On November 9, 1918, a new republic was declared, and the beleaguered Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate the throne. In the end, Germany's surrender brought an end to the war, and a new era of uncertainty and transformation began. World War I reshaped the global geography. 4 mighty empires crumbled to dust: Germany, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia. As the dust settled, numerous nations reclaimed their independence, while new ones emerged from the ashes. The war marked the downfall of 4 illustrious dynasties: the Romanovs, Hohenzollerns, Habsburgs, and Ottomans. The conflict left deep scars on Belgium, Serbia, and France, which mourned the loss of 1.4 million soldiers, with countless other casualties left uncounted. The state of war between the Allied powers and the Central Powers persisted for several months after the armistice in November 1918. The Treaty of Versailles was finally signed with Germany on June 28, 1919, but the United States Senate refused to ratify it despite public support. It wasn't until July 2, 1921, that the U.S. formally ended its involvement in the war, when President Warren G. Harding signed the Knox-Porter Resolution. For the British Empire, the war officially ended on different dates for each of the Central Powers. These dates marked the end of the war under the provisions of the Termination of the Present War, Definition Act 1918. The end of World War I is marked by 2 significant dates. While some war memorials recognize the signing of the Versailles Treaty in 1919 as the official end of the war, when many troops finally returned home, most commemorations focus on the armistice of November 11, 1918, when the fighting actually ceased. This dual recognition highlights the complexity of the war's conclusion, acknowledging both the formal treaty that brought peace and the moment when hostilities ended on the battlefield. During World War I, the devastating toll on human life and health was staggering. Out of 60 million European military personnel mobilized between 1914 and 1918, approximately 8 million lost their lives. 7 million were permanently disabled, and 15 million suffered serious injuries. The war's impact on individual countries was equally alarming. Germany lost 15.1% of its active male population. Austria-Hungary lost 17.1%, and France lost 10.5%. France mobilized 7.8 million men, with 1.4 million making the ultimate sacrifice, and 3.2 million returning home with injuries. A unique tragedy befell the gueules cassés, broken faces, approximately 15,000 soldiers who suffered gruesome facial injuries, leading to social stigma and marginalization. The war's impact on civilians was equally severe. In Germany, an estimated 474,000 more civilians died than in peacetime, largely due to food shortages and malnutrition that weakened disease resistance. This excess mortality includes 271,000 deaths in 1918 and 71,000 in the first half of 1919, when the blockade remained in effect. On November 11, 1918, the war that was supposed to end all wars finally came to an end. The sound of gunfire and explosions faded into an eerie silence. The once green fields, now scarred and barren, lay still. Exhausted soldiers on both sides emerged from their trenches, their eyes red from fatigue and tears. They gazed upon the ruins of what was once a beautiful world, now shattered by the horrors of war. As news of the armistice spread, families reunited, and strangers embraced. Tears of joy streamed down faces, mingling with the tears of sorrow for the loved ones lost. The world mourned the loss of a generation, the loss of innocence, and the loss of a sense of security. But amidst the grief, there was hope. Hope that the sacrifice would not be in vain, that the world would learn from its mistakes, and that peace would finally reign. As the sun set on that fateful day, the world whispered a collective prayer: never again.